Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. This video is for Core World Skyline High School 2019-2020. And it's time for us to get into our final project, which is going to be in response to Key Standard 7.4. Students will identify a pressing global problem and select the most promising political, technological, medical, or scientific advances being created to address these problems. You should know that this forum is going to be open until May 20th. So you have the better part of 4 weeks to get your final project done. Of course, best of luck with that. And this video is to try to help you understand what it is that you need to eventually end up doing. This is your rubric. You have 30 points, 1 point for background information or context, 1 point for thesis, 25 points for evidence that will support your argument. And of course, you need to cite your sources for your evidence, a conclusion, and a bibliography. You have the better part of 4 weeks again to get this done. So here we go. Let's try to launch into how it is that you're going to get this project done. So our history book stops being as helpful, of course, as it was before. And that means we're going to start to need to do some of our research with the tools that we have online available to us. So here is a list of some of the most pressing global problems. These are just, some suggestions for me of stuff that you could look into. Number one, that massive increase in population that we saw from Key Standard 7.2, and of course the impacts that has ended up having on the environment. As the human populations increase, of course, human beings end up having a much bigger and usually negative impact on the environment. So, for example, one of the key ways that we have ended up having this negative impact on the environment is by burning a whole lot more fossil fuels. And, that of course has eventually ended up having a lot more CO2 that's being released into the atmosphere. And CO2, of course, is a greenhouse gas, which has led to a huge world issue, climate change. Another potential subject you could look into is overfishing. Another subject you could look into is the bacteria that have begun to become resistant to our existing antibiotics and the problems that might end up having in the future. Another major world issue is plastic pollution in the oceans. Another major world issue is heart disease. If you are a human being on planet Earth today, there's about 1 in 3 chance that heart disease is going to be the thing that kills you. Deforestation, of course, especially in Southeast Asia and in the Amazon, is a major world issue. Food insecurity. Now, we're more used to talking about, say, the 2 billion people on the planet who are overweight or obese, but there is about 1 billion people on the planet today who are facing food insecurity. And that's a huge world issue. Since the Cold War, of course, the threat of nuclear war has presented as one of the major pressing global problems. You and I are separate from each other at this moment because of the threat of a global pandemic and how many people might die from it. That's a major world issue today. And of course, subjects like terrorism are pressing global problems. Those are just a list of potential subjects that you could dive into. You are, of course, welcome to pick some of your own. One of the most interesting subjects that I had students present on last year was say, drop in population of bees on the planet and so on. If you've got a question about whether you think your subject is a good one, please send me an email. And of course, your final project is going to be graded partially based upon how reliable your sources are. So reliable sources, of course, our library, see your librarian. Keep in mind that you can access Utah's online library here, onlinelibrary.uen.org. Anything that you find on Utah's online library is to be considered a reliable source. So here's how you go about doing your final project, right? You could go to Utah's online library, you could click on any of the above given, and you could start digging into your access to information. So if you were to click here, for instance, you could say, let's say you picked heart disease as your major pressing world problem. All of these are potential sources that you could use for getting your information, your evidence, right? So let's say we wanted to look here, right? If you were to say in your final project, your body makes all the cholesterol it needs. You don't need to include any in your diet. You could rephrase that into your own words, and you could cite this source right here. Again, keep in mind, here's the Chicago Manual. If you were to use website content, this is how you would put it in your footnote, and this is how you would put it in your bibliography. Anyway, so that's, of course, a potential way to go. Utah's online library is to be considered a reliable source, and anything that you find on here is to be considered good information, all right? So other good, reliable sources. Now, your final project needs to come across as if it is from a global perspective and not simply from a perspective of the United States. So the only really truly universal global organization on the planet is the United Nations. And any information you get from the United Nations is to be considered reliable source, as well as is anything that's from an associated organization like the FAO or the World Health Organization, right? So if you were looking for information about, say, World Health Organization heart disease, right? So cardiovascular diseases, this is where you would go to get good information. So the number one cause of death globally, if you were to put that in your final project, you would go ahead and put that down and you would cite that just like this here, website content from the World Health Organization. And there you go. You have one of your pieces of information, 25 minimum, of course, that are going to be required. So that's how you do your research for this final project, all right? So the United Nations, the FAO, the World Health Organization, those are all to be considered good, reliable sources. Now, there are a bunch of other global sources. Of course, you've seen lots of them in our class so far. Things like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Economic Forum. Keep in mind, a lot of these global organizations are going to be very into trying to keep world trade flowing and trying to prevent barriers from world trade. So they tend to be very right-leaning organizations, very capitalistic organizations. Government websites are to be considered reliable sources. Look for .gov, something like, say, the CDC, the National Institute of Health. Now, government organizations, they tend to be more reliable sources, but just like any potential source, they can have issues, right? All of the sources from our class. So like, for instance, your textbook was from the National Geographic, right? So let's say I was looking for information about, say, plastic pollution, right? There you go. We have information from National Geographic, plastic pollution. Any information from here is to be considered from a good, reliable source also, right? Now, corporate websites are to be considered reliable sources to the extent that you realize, of course, that a corporate website is going to be usually designed in such a way as to make the corporation itself look good, right? So I don't know, let's say we were looking for the most wealthy corporations in the world. We could go Fortune 500 companies, right? We could find that, like, say, Walmart is the number one. And then we could, or I think that's number one right now, but we could go there to get information about, I don't know, let's say, the Walmart Corporation is doing to try to limit, say, greenhouse gas emissions or something like that. Next up, registered non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace or Human Rights Watch and so on. Keep in mind, these are reliable sources, but they tend to be left-leaning, so watch out for some of that bias. University websites, look for .edu. They are to be considered reliable sources for the purposes of our class. Scientific studies from quality journals are to be considered reliable sources for our class. However, that being said, most scientific studies, I mean, as a 15 or 16-year-old kid, it's just not likely that you're able to fully comprehend all of the information. But let's say you were looking for information from nature.com, right? All of this is to be considered reliable sources. So let's say I was looking for information about heart disease, right? Nature, look at this. I mean, we have one after another. They're open access. Anybody can get access to this information. And there's just tons of information you could get about, say, heart disease or other information from scientific studies. Anyway, good, high quality scientific studies are posted in quality journals like Nature, The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, or Cell. You can use media. I mean, we're talking about current events here, right? But if you're going to use information from the media, you need to know that you need to not use sources that are obviously slanted towards one political party. So use BBC to avoid American political issues, or Reuters, or the Associated Press. Do not use, for example, Fox News or MSNBC, because they tend to be obviously biased in favor of one political party. High quality medical journals or organizations are to be considered reliable sources. So, like, for instance, the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic, right? So let's say I was looking for Mayo Clinic, heart disease. We should know the Mayo Clinic is to be considered a reliable source. Information that you get from the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic, those are to be considered reliable sources. If you have read books about the subject that you are passionate about, those are to be considered reliable sources, preferably books from university presses, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Cite your sources in your presentation, your project, like this here. And if you have any questions about your subject or about how to research into your final project, please let me know. Ladies and gentlemen, this is due May 20th. I know many of you will get very into your final project. Of course, if you go above and beyond 25 sources, that's perfectly fine. I've had students in the past get very passionate about their final project, and I wouldn't be surprised if you have quite a lot more than that. But 25 sources minimum. Let me know if you have questions. My email address you should have. Good luck.